Welcome. Today we are going to discuss one interesting topic about epistemology. Our topic is truth. In order to analyze this topic, we have distinguished several questions. Question 1, correspondence theory of truth. Question 2, objection to the correspondence theory of truth. Question 3, pragmatic theory of truth. And question 4, objections to this conception. In our next question, we will discuss about a true belief with very bad consequences. And question 6 is opposite to this question, to the last question. Namely, it's about a false belief with good consequences. Question 7, it is about coherence theory of truth. And question 8, it's about objections to this conception. And our last but not least question about the criterion of justification and the conditions of truth. Okay, let's start with the question 1. Correspondence theory of truth. What can we say about this topic? This theory makes several main claims. You can see 5 of them in this slide, on this slide. Claim 1. A proposition is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts. For example, the proposition that you are pale is true because of, or in virtue of, the fact that you are pale. Our next claim can be stated in the following way. A proposition is false if and only if it fails to correspond to the facts. And our claim 3 can be stated in the following way. The truth of a proposition of belief is dependent on the facts or upon the way the world is. And we can formulate our next claim in the following way. One and the same proposition cannot be both true and false. For example, the proposition that you are pale cannot be both true and false. And what can we say about our last claim? It states that one and the same proposition cannot be true for you and false for me. The truth is not relative in this way. Of course, you might believe some proposition that I reject. We might thus disagree about the truth of some proposition. Still, the truth of the proposition is determined by the facts and not by whether you or I believe it. And what can we say about the objections to the correspondence theory of truth? We can distinguish at least 2 objections here, and you can see objection 1 and objection 2. Okay, let's start with the objection 1. The correspondence theory of truth is uninformative because the notion of a fact is obscure. And if we move to the objection 2, we can say that one cannot explain what fact is without making use of the concept of truth and falsity. And therefore, the correspondence theory is circular and ultimately unenlightening. What can we say about the pragmatic theory of truth? Can this theory offer us a better description, a better explanation about the nature of truth? In order to answer to these kind of questions, we can distinguish at least 2 basic claims about the pragmatic theory. Okay, our first claim is that true beliefs are generally useful and false beliefs are not. Therefore, a proposition is true if and only if believing it or acting on it is or would be useful in the long run. And our second basic claim states that a belief is true if and only if it is useful or expedient. We can use two examples in order to analyze, to clarify the content of these basic claims. Our first example, if a doctor wants to cure a patient, it is useful for the doctor to have two beliefs about what will cure the patient. Similarly, example 2 states that if a person wants to go to the Brisbane, it's a city in Australia, two ideas about the best way to get there are usually more useful than false ones. However, we can encounter objections to the pragmatic theory of truth too, and we can distinguish them by these ways. Objection 1, even if two beliefs are generally useful and false beliefs are not, it would not follow that we should identify true belief with useful belief. In other words, true belief is not identical with the useful belief. And our second objection is about consequences of the true beliefs. For example, I can say that sometimes a true belief might have very bad consequences, and a false belief might have very good ones. And similarly, there could be false propositions that are useful to believe or act on. How can we explain these objections? For example, I can take some true beliefs with very bad consequences. Suppose, for example, the following proposition is true. Person X will die in old age from a long and painful illness. You can put any proper name to the place of X, and we can name this proposition over proposition 1. Suppose further that if person X were to believe this, he would be quite distraught. The joy that he now finds in life would be greatly diminished. Therefore, it is not useful for this person to believe proposition 1. Still, since proposition 1 is true, it seems we should reject the view that a proposition is true if and only if believing it or acting on it would be useful. Similarly, we can use a false belief with good consequences. Imagine, for example, that person Y is old and suffering from his painful and fatal illness, and he consoles himself with the belief that others in the hospital are suffering more than I am, and doing so with courage. Let's say that this is our proposition 2. Believing proposition 2 helps person Y face his own suffering calmly and with courage. He thinks that since others are courageously facing suffering greater than his, then at least he can do the same. Therefore, believing proposition 2 is very useful for person Y. But suppose this proposition is false. Suppose no one in the hospital is suffering worse than person Y. Again, it seems that what is useful to believe is not always true. And in the epistemology, we can see a third conception about the nature of truth. This conception is named Coherence theory of truth. And let us consider the following examples that we may take to illustrate the coherence theory of truth. Suppose that I believe the following propositions. Proposition 1, I have the sense experience of something white in my hand. Proposition 2, I have the sense experience of something round in my hand. Proposition 3, I have the sense experience of something cold in my hand. And proposition 4, which states that there is a snowball in my hand, is coherent with proposition 1 through proposition 3. It would seem that proposition 4 better coheres with the proposition 1 to proposition 3 than other propositions. For example, that I have a hot lump of coal in my hand. Some philosophers take the fact that a proposition coheres with other propositions one believes to be indicative of its truth, or a good reason to believe it is true. In other words, they treat coherence as the source of justification. So, for example, if one believes proposition 1 to proposition 3, then, other things being equal, it is more reasonable to believe proposition 4 than that one has a hot lump of coal in one's hand, because of proposition 4's greater coherence with proposition 1 through proposition 3. Proponents of the coherent theory of truth also take coherence to be a condition of truth. They hold that for a proposition to be true is nothing more than a matter of its coherence with other propositions. And what can we say about the objections to this conception, I mean coherence theory of truth? For example, we have distinguished here three objections: objection 1, objection 2, objection 3. Okay, let's start with objection 1. The concept of coherence is murky. It is at least as much in need of explanation as those of correspondence and fact. Objection 2. We cannot say simply that a proposition is true if and only if it belongs to a coherent set of propositions. A very realistic piece of fiction might be a coherent set of false propositions. And objection 3. The fact that proposition 4 on the previous slide coheres with other propositions, I believe, such as proposition 1 to proposition 3, does not guarantee that proposition 4 is true. I might believe proposition 1 to proposition 4 and be merely having a hallucination of a snowball, or merely dreaming that I am holding a snowball. Indeed, Descartes raised the possibility of massive deception by an evil demon, deception so massive that most of our sense experience of the world is illusory. In such a scenario, our beliefs about the world around us would be almost entirely false. Still, they might be quite coherent. And we can distinguish another kind of objection to the coherent theory. And in order to analyze it, we can distinguish the criterion of justification and the condition of truth. Okay, let's start. Critics of the coherence theory of truth also argue that we should not confuse a criterion of justification with the condition of truth. And we should not assume that because we have a criterion of justification, we have ipso facto a condition of truth. Even if coherence turns out to be a source of justification, it does not follow that it is what makes a proposition true. Okay, that's all for today's discussion. Thank you for watching. See you later in our next online lectures. Thank you.